Hey everyone, we're really excited to be locking in another podcast that you guys can wrap your ears around. If you're not really sure, the vision and the idea of these podcasts is really to celebrate and to push into aspects of life and history and theology of the congregational churches and what it means to be part of the denomination in 2022. So we've been basically having these as kind of round table discussions, not so much round table, square table discussions between me and Michael. The idea for the future obviously is to bring other people in. We've had Lee Murray, who's a pastor of one of our churches in the Shire, and a few other people presenting in these contexts, but today we're going to have Michael and myself rather, and we're pushing into a controversial topic today. Everyone's going to get hot under the collar. We're going to be pushing into, and it's going to come across the screen, Assembly 2022. Now, I speak to people about Assembly, and let's be honest, people, and I know a lot of people in congregational churches around, and they're sort of like asking the question, why would we go? Why would we prioritise Assembly 2022? Why would we're going to be up in the Blue Mountains for this one? Why would we go? There's nothing that happens that's interesting. There's no meat in the bone in this for us. What's the point, you know? And Assembly probably, and hopefully I can be honest about this. I can just say this outright. Assembly's numbers, partly due to COVID and the context around that, but Assembly has been shrinking. And we'd really like to change that because we actually think Assembly is important. And I'm saying that as someone who's a little bit biased, but we would like to give a picture and a pathway of why we think you should go to Assembly 2022 if you're listening to this. And hopefully we can explain that today in the next 20 minutes or so. Yeah. So Michael, why is Assembly, this is a big question to jump into. Yeah. Right, we're going to push into some of the history and maybe even what the Bible would teach about this, particularly for our own churches. But yeah, big question to open with. Why go? What's the point? You know, what's the point? Just big picture.
Well, big picture, Assembly is our organisational gathering to be able to conduct the business and work of our fellowship. This is the time when our churches come together to talk about the various things that are happening, the decisions that we're going to make. We pass budgets, we pass resolutions, we decide on where we might be spending money, and we decide about how we're going to raise money, which missionaries we're going to support. There's a lot of things I think in the past that have just gone from year to year, but we're at a particular point in the life of our fellowship where this particular assembly I think is going to be really important for our fellowship going forward. So what I say to churches is if you want to have a voice in the life of our fellowship, then coming to Assembly is the critical and important thing to do. It's to be there.
Well, part of the implications of being congregational, and there's a whole bunch of things you could unpack about what that actually means, but it's a grassroots movement. Things need to be driven by delegates or members of churches for them to happen even at the highest levels. Is that a fair description?
Yeah, that's right. And I think, you know, as we've been talking about this, it's not just because this is a business meeting for our fellowship and if we want to have a say that we should go. I think this actually theologically says something about what we see as the place of church as Congregationalists. I mean, Congregationalists are pretty defined by our autonomy and independency and local governance. But when we think theologically about the church, the family that is the church doesn't just stop with the local gathering of us there. We're able in geographical areas with like-minded people able to come together and do things as gathered congregationals coming together that we wouldn't individually be able to do. We're able to talk about bigger picture things that extend beyond our local area where our church is, here in Revesby. We're able to talk about what does it mean for the gospel in New South Wales and in Australia, and what does it mean for the gospel going worldwide. And we're able to do that in a way when we come together at Assembly that we can't do in our local congregations.
So it's interesting, isn't it? Like we're independent, we're autonomous, and again, that could mean a whole bunch of different things for different contexts, but we're also interrelated. And so I think a lot of our history, and I would even say theology as congregational churches would imply that, but can we give some really kind of meat to that? So I know I remember talking about a thing called the Savoy Declaration many years ago when I was at SMBC. How does that illustrate or inform what we're talking about?
Well, I think the Savoy Declaration, like other creedal statements, tells us about what the church is. And the church doesn't stop just with the local gathering. We are brothers and sisters, part of a universal church. And while we see that there will be a one day where the whole universal church will be gathered together under our good King Jesus, worshipping him, giving him praise, because the Lamb is worthy and we're going to be there before his throne. There are times in the life of the church where like-minded congregations can come together and, in a way, I hope, in our worship time, in our gathering together, experience part of what it is to be part of the universal church. And the Savoy Declaration and other like-minded creedal statements give us that emphasis of the church gathering universally, or a picture of the universal church gathering together. They also give us a picture of the church, which I think is really pictured in the scriptures as family, family and household. And the reality is that in a complex world where more and more our local church gatherings need to be compliant with government institutions and rulings, we need a body like the fellowship to be able to help us to kind of navigate those things. And for the fellowship to be able to navigate that, then we need input, both in terms of people, resources, employing, and financial as well for those kinds of things.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I was actually listening to another podcast on, theology of institutions, and it's really interesting. Like, we can't often find an explicit biblical parallel behind a lot of these institutions, like a denomination, for example. And yet, in our culture, because of the reality and the necessities of running a church in Australia in 2022, denominations have an integral part in what we want to do and how we want to achieve it. And I think they actually serve the local church. So, yeah, and in case you're wondering what the Savoy Declaration is, not everyone might know, it's kind of, what was it, 1600s?
Yes. So it was a creedal statement put together by the Puritans, particularly those that were Congregationalists or government. And it was a declaration and a statement of faith. Now, there's the Westminster Assembly, which is basically the precursor for the Presbyterians. The Savoy Declaration, you might sort of say, is a bit of the Congregationalists doing a word processing and editing it,
making it apply to them. Yeah. And some names that made a lot to me, but maybe not to everyone else, like John Owen was a contributory. Thomas Goodwin. I don't know. You could probably rattle off other names, but some brilliant scholars and intellectuals writing into this. Let's focus in on maybe more of our own story, because we're not in England, we're not in the US, where a lot of congregational church history is. We're in Australia, and obviously we were formed in 1977. How does Assembly, there's probably good things from that and maybe some unhelpful things from that heritage, but how does that follow out or flow out of that history there?
Well, there's a balancing act between the church being family and being and being part of and setting up structures that enable good gospel work and ministry to happen. So we would say, Paul appointed elders, or, saw that people like Timothy would appoint elders and leaderships in the various churches. There was an autonomy of each of those congregations, and Paul's writing to them was as a member of the universal church, concerned about their care and instruction. In a way, Paul's care and role as an apostle could be kind of have similarities between, director of ministry. Now, I don't want to push too heavy that theological aspect of it, but I want to say that there are PRO. There are people outside of the local gathering who can have spiritual input into the life of the church. And historically, the fellowship came about, as we know, because there was an institutional structure that was being moved from people with saying, let's move away from the congregational union structure and let's merge three different distinct groups that were in the Australian Christian landscape at that time.
Form the Uniting Church?
Yeah, form the Uniting Church. So that was the Methodists, the Presbyterians and the Congregationalists. And so what they were going is, we're operating under this one institutional structure. We think we can do more together by merging and operating together. Now, there's a whole thing of different cultures, different theological positions coming together. But in the Congregational Union at the time, there was a subset of the Congregational Union, you know, our evangelical brothers and sisters who kind of found that the Congregational Union was, you know, basically making its way into liberalism, or had made its way into liberalism.
When you say liberalism, you mean by denying fundamental tenets of Christian faith, like the resurrection, for example?
And various different aspects of scriptures and God's word. And so what happened was that the evangelicals within the Congregational Union, I think, epitomised this coming together as family. They came around a different structure, a thing called the Board of Evangelism. And that Board of Evangelism acted as a family for evangelical churches to be able to operate. That Board of Evangelism became the precursor for the fellowship. It was many of those churches that came into the fellowship of Church.
So from its inception, there was a collegiality, a working togetherness.
A deep sense of we're coming together as family, we're operating together as family, we're working together in that way. Now, maybe the thing that was probably not, I want to choose my words carefully here, in hindsight's a wonderful thing, isn't it? But looking back, taking the structures of the Congregational Union and then applying it in terms of constitution to the FCC may not have been the most helpful thing. There was a potential, I suppose, to revisit and maybe even look at reforming and bettering those things. Constitution-wise, yeah. But the structure that was there put in place was really, I think, geared around the idea that this is what helps us as families of churches come together and be the family of the fellowship.
And in a sense, Assembly is probably the best, well, maybe not the best, but one of the key manifestations of that collegiality. Yeah, cool. So we commit to like a broader body, the fellowship. We commit to a broader network, a broader body of churches beyond our own. I've got it in my notes here. We're also, I mean, I'd say this is a call on all Christians to serve rather than to be served. Do we want to talk into that? So we're called to serve a denomination. We're called to give into it. I mean, yeah, do you want to expand on that? I think I know what you were trying to say when we prepared for this, but what are your thoughts on that?
So our service to God doesn't just stop, you know, with our own families or the local congregation. There is an ability for our giftings and strengths to be used for the benefit of the wider fellowship. There are things that we may be gifted at that don't get much application in the local congregation, but can get a much deeper and greater application in the wider fellowship. Not all of our churches go through building projects in different seasons, revitalisation of facilities, and processing DAs or things along those lines. But there are people within our fellowship, within our churches, who are skilled and gifted in those kinds of things. There may be skills and abilities that people have as a result of their employment that could be applied to various different other situations. And again, some of the day-to-day ministry things that happen within the local congregation are quite different from the things that happen within the broader fellowship.
So it's a context in which we can exercise more of our gifting and even lend those gifts to not only the service of our own local church, but the fellowship, the larger church.
And not just our fellowship, not just Congregationalists, but Christians broader across our city, across our state, across our nation.
Cool. So I'm going to throw a curveball at you. No preparation. I like to do this. So again, one of the critiques I've heard of Assembly in the past is we talk about stuff that doesn't matter and we deliberate on minutiae, again, like the minutiae of constitutional detail or a phrase or emotion. So what would you say to that? We talk about stuff that fundamentally doesn't really affect the everyday running of a church. Like what would we do or say to that sort of objection?
Well, I think the thing is with Assembly, for Assembly to work well, we need to come to Assembly prepared. So we need to be thinking about what is on the agenda here for Assembly. This is both from people like you and I in terms of the executive and those committees that operate within that. maybe sometimes in members' meetings we kind of go, yeah, we're going to talk about budget and finances and various different things, without really kind of like an agenda in our mind. I think when it comes to Assembly, we need all of us, delegates and people who are involved in committees, to be prepared and to say, okay, what is it that needs to be done? What is it that needs to be talked about? We all know in business meetings that, again, we can quite easily fall in minutiae and things like that. Along with that preparation, and by that I mean prayerful preparation, thinking about agenda and items, talking to people in committees, discussing various different things, I think there's a real benefit for our pastors, for example, in our things like our pastors gathering to talk about these things, to put some legs to ideas that we have in mind, so that when it comes to actually Assembly, we're able to do concrete things within that regards. We're able to say, yeah, we've had the preliminary discussions. Now, this is not just simply a mechanism for us to vote on things, but a lot of the heavy lifting has been done before it comes to Assembly. Now, some people would like us to have, I suspect, more time to talk about more things at Assembly. There is a balancing act between the size of things, the amount of people that are coming, the time. In our business meetings, we might have 20 people giving up an hour, that's 20 hours. Go to Assembly, when we haven't had 200 delegates, but 100 delegates, that's 100 man hours being given, or 100 days of people if it goes for a whole day. We want to be recognising what people are giving in that. And so a lot of the preliminary and heavy lifting work done beforehand can really enable us, I think, to be more effective in Assembly as well.
And ironically, I think the more people buy in, the more people come, the more actually people come, like you were saying, prepared, the more I think media stuff would actually be decided. And I think even things moving forward in a more constructive way, which is one of my critiques when I push back. Actually, people probably need to buy into it for it to actually have meaning. Anyway, that's a bit of a kick up the bum for people who are listening. Anyway, you mentioned earlier this idea that some big things are maybe going to be decided in 2022. And by the way, I'm going to be talking to a lot of people about coming to Assembly for 2022. I might tap you on the shoulder. Please ask your church to nominate you as a delegate. So put that in your diary. What's the date? September something. I'll let you know.
October, I think, isn't it?
Oh, it's October, is it? Okay, well, anyway, somewhere later in the year. I probably should know that. But anyway, I'm going to be tapping people on the shoulder.
Underneath on this.
Anyway, so hopefully I can just be really blunt about this. The FCC is coming in to a fair bit of money. We're inheriting a chunk of finance through one of our buildings being sold. And one of the things we are really excited about is potentially some of the opportunities that would open up for the FCC. So that's a big thing we really want to push into, visioning what we do with that, giving a plan, giving a pointed purpose behind what we want to do with some of those funds. And that's actually going to involve people getting behind that as well. But do you want to maybe expand on that? Because I'm being a little bit oblique with what I'm saying.
So the fellowship, it's quite clear, anyone who's been going to Assembly for the last couple of years, that the financial position and basis of which the fellowship operated has changed over the years. We're about to enter, some are saying, another potentially great recession or economic headwinds, whatever kind of language that you want to use. Costs are going up and various different things are happening. The fellowship has previously had the benefit that when it came out of the Congregational Union, it had this basis of funds to be able to allow it to operate, to be the source of its income. And generally that means we've operated with voluntary contributions from our churches. People who've engaged in the work have given, and no church has had to say, pay their dues to be a part of the church, to be part of the fellowship. That's left us at a point now with the headwinds, the economic headwinds that we've had over the last decade, without having that financial basis there before us. And it does mean we either curtail the activities of the FCC, we reduce. We reduce down to sort of running on the smell of an oily rag, doing the bare minimum and asking volunteers to do everything, or we operate with a sense of this is what's needed to fund these ministries going forward. For the fellowship to grow, I think we seriously need to look at what can we do in order to enable the right level of funding for people in the various roles that we would like to see to be able to do that full time, to have their complete and whole headspace, pointing towards the things within the fellowship. To do that, we need to be strategic about the potential funds that the funds that we're receiving being used in those kinds of ways. We want to really push into what can we do with those funds that both honour the desire of the church that has left them for us, to see churches flourish and planted and to be grown in the wider area of our fellowship. What can we do to do that? What things can we put in place that can see that end be achieved? But also, how can those funds be used so that our fellowship is there to be able to see those things to come into place? Because it's one thing to have this vision for these funds, but if the fellowship as it is at the moment doesn't continue to exist in the future, then those things could potentially become a white elephant. It could become, we invest in a building that there's no one there to be able to minister out of because the fellowship doesn't exist.
So I'm understanding you rightly, instead of maybe investing all that money into, say, one building or one church planting initiative or one pastor or one X, Y, and Z, we're actually going to try and build into the infrastructure of the FCC, try and improve it, try and grow it, and that's part of the vision we're going to try and sell anyway, and that is a good way to actually ensure that the FCC continues, plus that we can actually do what some of the churches the church that has donated the funds has requested of the funds, which is to plant churches and have new ministry endeavours across Sydney. So I think that's really, really exciting as I hear it. But can we put some flesh to that? So the things that come to my mind that are probably of pretty key importance in the FCC, and I don't think anyone would agree with me, is probably recruiting of pastors and training up existing pastors, and maybe even resourcing churches that maybe are struggling for resource. But what do you think of that?
Well, we can't plant new churches without having church planters. We want to grow our own church planters. We want people who understand our culture, theologically are aligned with us, are able to operate in the shape and form that we are a part of. We said in a previous podcast episode how wonderful it was for you yourself to come through a congregational church. We want to see more of that happen.
There should be 10 Tim Foskett's coming out.
We need to have systems and structures in place that identify people, provide the funding. And we need to do that in a long-term way as well, because we're not going to get church planters overnight. We need to be working out those systems in place. Of course, there's no point planting churches and operating and starting new churches if we're closing down existing churches. In a lot of cases, we might be considered asset rich and cash flow poor. So I think we need to think strategically about the funds. Is there something that we can do with those funds in terms of investment for church planting that can lead us to be able to plant churches in new areas, but also can those investments provide income to the fellowship that means that we can keep doing that sustainably and viably.
And I'd also add, you're talking about planting, which is awesome, but also revitalising. And I think you mean that, like revitalising small struggling churches. Because and what you said about, resource poor but asset rich. We have buildings and assets in many amazing places in Sydney and New South Wales. And it's just like, can we get certain planters or revitalisers into these churches? I think that's sort of echoing your vision.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And I think, planting and revitalisation, they go hand in hand. I think what planting emphasises is a desire for people who haven't heard the gospel to come to knowledge. And it's well said that often planting is the pointy end of evangelism in the life of churches. That's where people have to go out and tell others about the gospel of Jesus and make that known. Revitalisation is where our churches reconnect with their mission and purpose in Jesus. And sometimes what needs to happen with revitalisation is having people come in with enthusiasm and skill to be able to identify what things need to take place in the life of the church, to encourage people, to build them up, But often also alongside of that is resources to be able to have that person be able to be there sustainably for a period of time.
I think the thing that excites me is, and I'm probably a little bit biased because I'm coming up with some of these ideas as well, but there's a clear strategic plan by which we really want to use some of these resources. So we're going to be making, I don't know, is the right word a motion or a proposal or something along those lines? Expect that, come and vote for that if that's something that really excites you.
Well, I'd say take a step back of that. Talk to us now.
Yes, but we are going to put out some content.
content.
We're going to probably put together some videos, distribute to our churches. By all means, come and push back. If we upset you and trigger you, come and talk to us as well, because we really want to use those funds and those resources well for gospel ministry, not just for 2022, but for 2032 and 2052 and 3022. We want to make it go on and go on, and we're really excited by the opportunity, but we need people to come and get behind it. Is that a fair way to wrap and to
yeah, I would basically say that the endeavours that we have to do and wish to do, if people come to us beforehand, this is a way of iron sharpening iron. I'm not being a patriarchal head of our fellowship and saying, here's my plans and ideas and let's do things this way. I realise that there are sharp minds within our fellowship who can make the ideas that we have and or bring their own ideas. That means that we can have a richer and more wonderful thing for Revital.
But obviously that involves buy-in and people being involved. Anyway, guys, hopefully this has been stimulating. I'm just looking at the time. Hopefully this has triggered some thoughts, some ideas, even some dreams. We're dreaming, we're getting hopeful. By all means, push us back, talk to us, message Tim Foskett at fcc.ors.org.au, I think is the email, and we'll get in touch and we'll have a chat, and then Michael will argue with you as well. I'm sure he'll be happy to do that. We're going to wrap it there, guys, but Assembly 2022, more information will come out. We'd love to see you there, and we'll wrap it up there. Thanks, Michael, for giving us your thoughts. I appreciate that.
No worries. Thanks, Tim.
See you guys next time.